Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS, and warm welcome to all of you. Good evening to all of you who have been joined. Please confirm that I am audible as well as visible to you all. Done. So, good evening to all and welcome to the disaster management class. Hope many of you have seen the question paper of prelims, which was on Sunday. So, which was based on morely NCRT and basic things. So, if you stick to your basics, then there will not be much issue with reference to UPSC examination. So, you have to be good enough in NCRT and application parts. If you are good in NCRT basics, applications, and current affairs, I don't think you will have any difficulty in cracking UPSC examination. Again and again, I'm telling you, NCRT books are foundations from class 8th up to 12th. So if you read the textbooks from 8th to 12th, they are more than sufficient for any subject. Any subject. You can take geography, you can take ecology, you can take polity. So they become the base. They become the base for any subject which you are preparing for UPSC. Right. Now, again, you don't have to worry about the cutoffs and all. So you have to make your spontaneous preparations. You should keep on preparing the prelims and mains as a consolidation effort, right? Till you achieve your success, right? So there is nothing called as segregation of prelims from the mains. It is group of both. So when you are making integrated approach, then it becomes easy for you to even for prelims as well as mains perspective, right? So we'll start the disaster management class, the session. So I'm Basavaraj. So I'll be taking this disaster management. So there will be 5 sessions on disaster management, right? So 5 sessions on disaster management, right? So you can make the running notes. You can make some references. Anyway, the contents are there in the PPTs. You can make the notes from that. There won't be any much issues. And moreover, whatever is there in the PPTs and the discussions, I think that suffices the requirement for the mains as well as sometimes when it is asked in the prelims. Now, where do you find this disaster management in your UPSC examination? So this is found in the paper 3. More specifically, it is in the mains. Now, sometimes you should not surprise if it appears in the prelims also, because some acts, certain statements can be seen in the prelims as well. So don't neglect that for the prelims point of view, right? So in the mains, it is in the third paper, and prelims, any acts, any statements, any technology can be asked in the context of the prelims part from disaster management. Now, here in this 5 day session, I'll be taking the topics which will be discussing on introduction, then types of disasters, vulnerability profile of India, then a cycle, disaster management cycle, then international approach, which is Sendai framework, then with reference to India, how the disaster management architecture, acts, policies, and infrastructure perspectives are there in India. Along with that, important institutions which are associated with disaster management. So we will have an overview of all these. Now, what should be your strategy when you are reading your disaster management, or what should be kept in the mind when you read the disaster management? Now, the basic perspective is you should be good enough in geography, basics of geography, and you should be good enough in many phenomenons. In the context of geography, you have read about earthquake when you studied geomorphology. You have read about landslide, mass movement, etc. So in geomorphology, you have studied many phenomenons, volcanic activities, earthquake phenomenons, landslide phenomenons, tsunamis, etc. Right? So you should have certain idea that what exactly is this earthquake? What is tsunami? What is landslide? Because these definitions will be very important when you're writing your answers. So something about that particular disaster or that particular hazard or that particular event you should know. Plus, in geography, there is something called as regional part. We say it regional geography. So you should be good enough in regional geography. Now, why this regional geography is important? This regional geography talks about two perspectives, that is human geography and economic geography. Region perspective, human geography, and economic geography. In the human geography, you will understand about the settlements. What type of settlements are there? And what type of demography is there? Whether it is highly densely populated area, less densely populated area, or the population is having old age population, or children's are dominant. So it will give an idea about the settlements and demography. Then when you talk about economic activities, so you should be good enough in understanding that what type of economic activities are there where the event has occurred, where the event, for example, if the earthquake has occurred, now what type of activities are there? If the cyclone has struck, what type of activities are there? What type of industries are there? So this will help to understand the economic losses, right? So it is about what type of land or what type of agriculture activity, what type of industries are there. So you should be knowing these perspectives. Then, apart from this geographical approach, you should be knowing the effort which has been done in the context of disaster management. Now, we always find national and international efforts, both will be there. We have national as well as international efforts are there. Now, this international efforts, more specifically, we find after the United Nations organization which has been formed. That is after 1945. So after 1945, more amount of humanitarian assistance were started. And within that ambit of humanitarian assistance, we have to see what all efforts have been done in the context of disaster management. What policies, what framework have been done? What type of framework have been introduced? How we evolved over a period of a time, which makes the contribution in the context of technology transfer, financial aspect, or knowledge based transfer. So we have to understand the international efforts in that case. Plus, we have to be very good enough in knowing the national part, like national acts, National Disaster Management Act, the structures, the policies which are associated with that. So we have to be making an assessment of both the parameters, national as well as international approach. Then you should be very good enough in understanding the current affairs, where the particular event has taken place. Some examples, like if it is cloud bursting, where the cloud bursting has taken place. If you are talking about heat waves, at present we are finding this heat waves are dominant in the northern plains. Why this heat waves is there? Where the heat waves is dominant? What type of methodologies are seen here? So you have to be good enough in knowing these parameters, heat waves and all. Plus, along with that, when you're reading your current affairs, we always come across the technologies which plays an important role in disaster management. I'm using the term the technology in the sense R&D, research and developments are being done, and these technologies will always provide cutting edge technologies, that is updated technologies in the context of disaster management. Cutting edge technologies or updated technologies in the context of disaster management, right? Now this you should be updating in your preparation. For example, if you are talking about the early warning systems to be identified, we come across a latest development. If you are reading current affairs, we come across something called as the collaborative approach between isro and nasa isro and nasa, which they will be launching a satellite called as nisar. NASA ISRO synthetic aperture radar. Now, this will be something which makes a very significant impact on understanding the earthquakes, volcanic activities, and landslides. So, such types of anything which is reflected as a new terminologies or innovation, you have to make a data of that. And possibly this can be in your prelims also, and this can appear in your mains also. In your mains also. Is that clear? Now, keeping these things in the mind, we will try to understand the disaster perspectives. Right. Now, the moment when we talk about disaster, we always come across certain terminologies, certain words are there, certain terminologies are there, which plays very important role. And there is very thin line of demarcation between the words. For example, we come across a term disaster, hazard. We come across the term vulnerability, capacity. We come across the terms called as risk, crisis, etc. So there is very thin line of demarcation between these terms. And we'll try to understand what the terms meanings are and how we can use them in the context of writing good answers. Is that clear? So first we'll try to understand what exactly disaster mean. What exactly the disaster mean. Focus on understanding this. Now, any catastrophic event or sudden event, any catastrophic event or sudden, another name for sudden is catastrophic. Catastrophic. It can be, example, earthquake, or it can be a reactor explosion or nuclear explosion. Nuclear explosion. Right. So sudden events. So whenever earthquake or nuclear explosions are there, now you should understand that when I say earthquake and nuclear explosion, we always find the two events are associated with two entities. If you take earthquake, that is a natural event. And if you take nuclear explosion, that is man-made event. So any event, catastrophic event, which can be natural or man-made. Natural or man-made. And these events, they always leads to large amount of losses in the terms of deaths, in the terms of injury, in the terms of social loss, in the terms of economic loss, like properties, buildings, industrial premises. So large amount of losses will be there. So when we take deaths, injuries, social loss, economic losses, etc., generally we refer that as socio-economic losses. Socio-economic losses. So if any catastrophic event, which can be natural or man-made, which leads to huge socio-economic losses, and these economic losses are such that the local people, they are unable to handle the situation with their own resources. The local people are unable to cope up or handle the situation. Cope up or handle the situation from their own resources. From their own resources. So such types of losses where they're unable to cope up with their own resources like financial resource, food resource, economic resource, any type of resources, they are unable to handle the situation with their own resources. And such types of losses or such types of events, we refer that as a disaster. Disaster. So they always need outside help. They always need outside help. outside help. And such losses, we refer them as the disaster. So hence the definition is any type of event, catastrophic event. It can be man-made or natural, which brings huge socio-economic losses in terms of injuries, deaths, collapse of buildings, psychological loss, trauma, etc., where the local people are unable to handle the situation, cope up the situations with their own resources like food, water, medicine, economic resources. And such events, we refer them as a disaster. And they always need outside help. So that becomes the definition of disaster. Very simple definition. Is that clear? It is any event or mishap or calamity which can be man-made or natural. Any event which can be natural or man-made, which brings huge amount of socio-economic losses. Socio-economic losses, where the local people, the local communities are unable to handle the situation, unable to cope or handle the situation with their own resources, with own resources. So this is referred as the disaster. Yes, Akshay, COVID is a disaster. COVID is a disaster. Is that clear? So this becomes the definition. Very perfect. We'll discuss about COVID also. COVID is a natural disaster, right? There are certain criteria. Now, if you're reading your current affairs, we come across cold waves and heat waves. Now, you should be very careful that. I'll explain why not also. Cold wave is a natural disaster, but heat waves is not considered as natural disaster in the context of India. It is not referred as notified disaster. We will see that later, but try to understand first the definitions. First, understand the definition. COVID is a notified natural disaster in India. Is it clear? No. So this becomes the definition, right? Any definition you can use. Any definition you can use, either from NCERT or from this book, right? So this is a disaster. So here the important punchline is the local people are unable to handle the situation with their sources or resources. Hence, it brings huge amount of socioeconomic losses, right? Now, if you are making an analysis of the natural hazards, we find that there has been tremendous change in the impact of natural disasters. They have increased in the magnitude, intensity, frequency, and damages caused have already increased. Now, what do you mean by magnitude, intensity, and frequency? Magnitude means area of impact. So we find area of impact has increased. Area of impact has increased. Now, what do you mean by intensity? Intensity means severity of that particular natural hazard. Severity of that particular natural hazard. Then frequency. Frequency means number of occurrences. Number of occurrences. Right. So we find that any event, if you take, it has increased in its area, magnitude. Initially, if you take the 10 years data, only few pockets were affected by heat waves. Now, entire northern plain is affected by heat waves. That is called as magnitude. If we take the intensity, the temperature was not that high. Now we find the temperature in the context of Delhi has reached to 51 degrees. So hence, it has become severe. And also, the occurrences have been increased. The numbers of occurrences have been increased. It is not only the heat waves, even in the floods, the areas have increased. If you take the droughts, in a state, 3 or 4 districts were affected. Now, the entire state is affected by the droughts. And its severity is also increased. So hence we say the magnitude, intensity, frequency and damages caused by natural hazards or natural disasters have increased. It is mainly because of increasing in the population. Population has increased, then over exploitation of natural resources. Over exploitation of natural resources. And growth in economic activities. Growth in economic activities. Right. So we have set up more industries. We have invested huge money in the infrastructures. So whenever these disasters are there, then the damages will always be higher side. The density of population means more injuries will be there. Is that clear? Then there is also a growing concern among the people to minimize the impact. Yes, this has been seen because with the effort which is done by international institutions, a systematic awareness has been created. Awareness has been created. And we also find there is a systematic development in research and that is R&D, where we are having different types of innovations, where we are having more amount of early warning systems, where we are having more amount of the measures by which we can minimize the impact. It is also seen, awareness is there, research and development has been seen. We are having more technological updates by which we are able to reduce or minimize the impact of any disaster. Then there has been a significant change in the patterns. Yes, there is significant change in the patterns. And these significant change in the patterns are mainly with reference to, say, land use patterns. Land use patterns. Right. Now, with increasing of the population, many forest areas are converted into agricultural lands. So it means that the land use has been changed. Apart from that, if you read the data, the incidents which took place in 2023, more specifically called as Joshimat land subsistence, it is mainly because of unsustainable activities, unsustainable religious activities, unsustainable tourist activities, where the carrying capacity was overexploited in that region. Right. So land use pattern is seen. Apart from that, we also find that due to impact of global warming and climate change, the climatic patterns have also been changed. So there has been a significant impact of global warming and climate change, which has altered the precipitation pattern, which has altered the many wind patterns, etc. So there has been a significant change in the climatic patterns, land use patterns, etc. And that is where we find there has been a tremendous change in the impact of the natural disasters. So please remember this. The magnitudes have increased, intensities have increased, frequencies have increased, in spite of having the awareness. And there has been a significant change in the patterns, land use patterns, unsustainable tourism, or global warming, climate change, lifestyles, fossil fuels. So all these are responsible for making a huge impact on the disasters perspectives. Is that clear? Now, next, we talk about something called as hazard. Hazard, right? Yes, Vishant, unsustainable tourism is the same thing. Unsustainable tourism is also the same thing, right? Now we move on to understand something called as hazard. Now, what exactly is this hazard? So hazard, the moment when we say it is a potential threat, hazard is a potential threat or dangerous event or condition. Potential threat, dangerous event or condition, which can make or which can bring socioeconomic losses. economic losses. Now here you should remember, all hazards are not disasters. All hazards are not disaster. But only those hazards where the local people is unable to cope up with the resources, then we refer that hazard as a disaster. Only those hazards where the local people is unable to cope up with their resources. Only those hazards we refer them as a disaster. So remember this. So all the hazards are not called as a disaster. Only those hazards where the local people are unable to cope up, we refer that as a disaster. So the idea of disaster management is not to convert the hazard into disaster. So the idea of disaster management is we should make sure that arrangements, facilities are done in such a way that the hazards are not converted into the disasters. Is that clear? So this is the difference between hazard and a disaster, right? Now, socio-economic losses means social and economic loss. Social means deaths, injuries, psychological traumas. We refer that as social loss. Economic losses means agriculture land, maybe due to floods, industries, infrastructure loss. We refer them as economic loss. When we combine them, we refer that as socio-economic loss. Example of hazard, any hazard you can take. Earthquake can be hazard, volcanic activity can be hazard, or any type of event can be hazard where the local people are able to control their condition. When it is beyond their condition, when it is beyond their control, the same hazard will become a disaster. When it is beyond their capacity to control, then we refer that as a disaster. Is that clear? Okay. So see, when we talk about similarity, the same event can be referred as hazard, the same event can be referred as disaster. But the only difference which makes is that the resources which are available with the local people, if it is sufficient for them to make themselves safe, we refer that as hazard. If it is beyond their resources to handle that, if they need extra help, then we refer that as a disaster. Right. Now, next is when we talk about the hazards, focus on understanding this. These hazards, they can be single event. The hazards, it can be single event. Like only one event is there. For example, a drought. It can be a single event. Or sometimes this hazard is something like this. The first event is, I'll explain what the terminologies are. If you take an evidences of the Sikkim in 2023, the first event was cloud bursting. We'll discuss what is cloud bursting later. This cloud bursting led to huge amount of rainfall over the lake called as Lonak Lake. Over the Lonak Lake. And this Lonak Lake is a glacial lake. And this cloud bursting is responsible for breaking up of that lake, which is referred as glacial lake outburst flood. We'll discuss what is GLOF later. We have to discuss that in detail. Lonak Lake, which led to glacial lake outburst flood. Glacial lake outburst flood. And this led to huge amount of water reaching downward. We refer them as flash floods, which lead to large amount of losses. So hence the hazard is followed by one after another. So we refer that as sequential sequential. So hence we say hazard can be a single event or it can be sequential. Hazard can be single event or it can be sequential. Yes, forest fire, droughts, earthquake, etc. So here, Kavya, if you see the example, if you see an example, it is something again. There has been a drought, and after this drought, forest fire, sequential event. Earthquake, then electric poles will be there. Short circuit can take place. Landslide can take place. So that can lead to forest fires, right? So these are referred as sequential events. These are referred as sequential events. Is it clear? So hence, remember, all hazards are not disasters. A hazard can be a single event or it can be sequential event, that is one followed by another. One followed by another. Water crisis in the recent days are, yes, we say it is a hazard. It is a hazard. Is that clear? Next, this is the definition. So whenever when you're writing, you should understand hazard means potential threat. So whatever I discussed, I have given that in the content. It can be for injuries, property damages, or it can be environmental loss also. So such losses, we refer them as hazards. Is that clear? So this is the definition of hazard. And it is characterized by where it has taken place, that is location, intensity or magnitude, and probability. Location means where it has occurred. Intensity means its severity, because you have to calculate what losses are there, right? Then frequency means number of occurrences. So if you remember these points, that is more than sufficient. GLOF is glacial, lake, outburst, flood. Is that clear? Right. Now, I'm unable to understand. See, Nikhil, it is simple as it is. Any type of event where it has made a losses, if the local people are having their own type of medical facilities, if they're having own type of money, they can come back into normalcy by their own resources. They are not huge resource, huge losses. We refer that as hazard. And if the event, if the magnitude, if the intensity is so large that the building collapses are more, they don't have food, they don't have water, they don't have any type of availability with them. Like if you see the cyclone, so during the cyclone, entire infrastructure collapses. They don't have drinking water for themselves, they don't have food for themselves. They have to depend on somebody who can provide them water, somebody who can give them medical facilities, somebody who can provide them other part. So such types of the resources which are not sufficient for them to recover, then we refer that hazard as a disaster. Is that clear? So this is what we refer them as disasters. Okay. Right. All disasters, see, I told you all the disasters are not natural. There are some disasters which are man-made. There are some disasters which are natural. We'll discuss that later. First, understand the definition and meaning between the disaster and hazard. Later, we will discuss that. See, when the atomic bomb was there in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that is also a disaster. And that is what we refer them as man-made disaster. If you take an example of Russian war, Ukraine war, that is also a disaster, but that is man-made disaster. And sometimes when we come across explosion in the nuclear reactor, that is man-made disaster. So we have a set of disasters which are called as natural disasters. There are certain disasters which are referred as man-made disasters. So hence I told that this disaster can be natural as well as man-made. Both are there. Understand the difference between them, right? So when I persuade more, then we will discuss or differentiate what is natural and what is man-made. Right. So as Chernobyl is a man-made disaster. We'll discuss that later. First, understand the different. Is it clear? Next, classification of hazards. Now here you should remember the integrated research on disaster risk has classified the hazards into 6 families. Sometimes they may ask them in the mains. What are the 6 families of the hazards? The first one is geophysical hazard. It is also called as geological hazard. So one request is focus on the discussion. So if you focus on the discussion, at least you will absorb 80 to 90% of the discussion. Whatever your doubts are there, keep them aside. So I'll be taking up of all those, like natural disaster, man-made disaster. I'll be segregating them once it is needed. So first understand the simple definitions. First understand the basics, what are disaster and what is hazard. Then we will define them. Then we will classify them into different ways. Right. Geophysical hazard. It is also referred as geological hazard. It is also called as geological hazard. Geological hazard. It is mainly due to solid nature of Earth. It is mainly due to solid nature of Earth. Nature of the Earth. That is the lithosphere or the crust. The lithosphere or the crust, like earthquake, volcanoes, etc. Earthquake, volcanoes, etc. We refer them as geophysical hazard. Is that clear? Sometimes they may ask the statements. Then there is something called as hydrological hazard. We all know that water is present above the surface and below the surface. And the water which is below the surface, we refer that as subsurface. Subsurface. So hence hydrological hazards are the hazards which are associated with presence, distribution, and movement of water. Presence, distribution, and movement of water. Where? On the surface and subsurface. Subsurface means groundwater. Surface and subsurface. Right. Then third one, meteorological hazard. Now what is this meteorological hazard? Now this meteorological hazard is due to extreme weather conditions. It is due to extreme weather conditions. And atmospheric phenomenon. And this meteorological hazard, they are maybe for hours or maybe for a days. If you take a storm, so the life of a storm is maybe half an hour, 1 hour, etc. If you take cyclone can be for 3 days or 4 days, which is atmospheric phenomenon. If you take heat waves may be for 1 day or 2 days, and that is extreme high temperature. So hence meteorological hazards are extreme weather conditions like high temperature, heat waves, storms, etc. Right? And they always operate from hours to days. Maybe for half an hour, 1 hour to 3 days, 4 days. And the area of operation is also very small. That is micro to meso. They operate micro to meso. Small to medium. Then next one is referred as climatological hazard. Now these climatological hazards, the area of their operation is medium to large. It means that they are meso to macro. Meso to macro, both. Macro means larger areas. And these events, climatological hazards, they can be for years together. Years together. Is that clear? Right. Then, biological hazard. So, what is biological hazard? So, biological hazard is something, take an example of plague, take an example of COVID. So, biological hazard is something which is due to exposure to the living organisms. Exposure to living organisms like bacteria, viruses, etc. Take a classical example is COVID, plague, etc. Or it is exposure to toxic substances. Exposure to toxic substances. Yes, you can give some parts like Nipah virus, right? So which is referred as the hazards, right? Monkeypox, if it is spreading very fast, right? So we refer them as biological hazards, exposure to living organisms. Then extraterrestrial hazards, sometimes a meteorite impact, sometimes asteroid impact, or some high radiations when they reach to the earth. We refer that as extraterrestrial hazards. So all the hazards are classified into 6 families. Is that clear? Okay. A pollution is a biological hazard. Yes, it is sometimes when it is associated with toxic substances. I'm using the term toxic substances. Is that clear? Extraterrestrial means maybe due to impact of asteroids, meteorites, or certain high energy radiations, which makes impact on the Earth's atmosphere or Earth's surface. We refer that as extraterrestrial hazards. Right. Now, geophysical hazards. Examples are mass movement, land subsidence, like Joshimat, land subsidence, earthquake, tsunamis, volcanic eruption. So these are examples of geophysical or geological hazards. Right. Then we talk about the hydrological one. So in the hydrological, this is hydrological. So in the hydrological, we have floods, we have landslides. Then meteorological hazards like severe storms or extreme temperatures, like heat waves, cold waves. Heat waves, cold waves, extreme temperature. Is that clear? Next is climatological one. So in the climatological, we have forest fires, over a period of a time, droughts, other types of events, they will make the forest fires. Long term, years together, over a period of a time when the temperature has increased, global warming, accumulation of greenhouse gases and all, which leads to the glacial lake outburst flood. We refer that as a climatological one. Biological, algal blooms, epidemics, insect infestation. Is that clear? Okay. How landslide is hydrological. Now, when we talk about the landslide can be triggered by earthquake, and sometimes this landslides can be due to the impact of water movement, flash floods, etc. Right. So the water which behaves and reduces the friction perspective. So hence they have classified the landslides under the hydrological droughts. Sorry, hydrological hazards. Right. Extraterrestrial, space weathers and near objects. Is it clear? See, when we talk about epidemic and pandemic, I'll discuss that. Pandemic, so when we say if you are reading your current affairs, COVID was a pandemic or COVID is pandemic. If you take the geographical extent, then we refer that as pandemic. If any disease spread to many countries, 30 countries, 40 countries, based on geographical extent, we refer that as pandemic. If in a one country, larger section of people are affected by the disease, we refer that as epidemic. 80% of the people, if this is a country A, 80% of the people or 70% of the people are affected by a disease, we refer that as epidemic. We refer this as epidemic. Is that clear? And COVID is pandemic, geographical extent. Is that clear? Okay. Now, types of hazards. They may ask questions separately. Types of hazards. They can be natural hazards. So this is where we classify them as natural and man-made hazards. Natural hazards, they can be floods, they can be droughts, or cyclones, thunderstorms, heat and cold waves, mass movements, volcanic eruptions, and biological one. So we refer them as natural hazards. We refer them as natural hazards. See, epidemic. This is an area A. Now, in this area, a plague has initiated. A plague disease has started. Now, 60% of the population or 70% of the populations are affected by the plague. Then in this area, declares plague as epidemic. It will declare plague as epidemic. So any disease is referred as epidemic when it covers more number of population in that area. If it is affecting 70%, 60% more number of populations are affected by that disease, then we refer that as epidemic. Yes, it is area specific or country specific. And if the disease is spreading to many countries, geographical extent, then we refer that as pandemic. Is that clear? Yes, epidemic and pandemic are biological hazards. Done. Okay. So these are natural hazards. Now, we also come across man-made hazards. So these man-made hazards are generally because of errors. We'll discuss them in detail later. Errors may be human error or technical errors. It can be human error or it can be technical errors. Right? Or it can be due to accidents. It can be due to accidents. Or sometimes they are deliberate. If you take Russia and Ukraine war, it is a deliberate throwing of the nuclear bomb in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. That is purposeful, deliberate. So there are certain events which are deliberate or with some purpose. So hence, these man-made hazards, they are based due to errors, accidents, deliberate or purposes. Is it clear? And they can be example of gas leaks, boiler leaks, etc. Or it can be a nuclear hazards, or it can be any type of explosions which takes place due to the combined effect of human, natural, as well as technical errors. Now, one difference strongly is that these man-made hazards can be avoided or they can be stopped. So these man-made hazard can be avoided. But natural hazards are something which cannot be avoided. Is that clear? Bhopal gas tragedy is a man-made hazard. Bhopal gas tragedy in 1984, where in Union Carbide factory, methyl isocyanide was leaked because of the error which was there in the technology. Right, so it is a man-made disaster because of a technological error. Equipments were not up to mark. right? And that methyl isocyanide was responsible for huge losses there. So it is a man-made disaster, which is referred as the chemical disaster, right? Right. So there are many such events which are seen. Right. Now, there is something which is called as socio-natural hazard. Now, what is the socio-natural hazard? Now, focus on understanding. See, a Kanchenjunga rail, yes, it is a man-made hazard, negligence. If they would have applied the Kavach, have you heard about Kavach? Anti-collision device, current affairs, right? So in your current affairs, we come across Kavach, anti-collision device. Now the government has initiated the process that we will be applying the anti-collision device Kavach in all the railways. Now the first time the Kavach was introduced was in Konkan Railway, in the Konkan Railway. So all such points you should be remembering. Is that clear? So they all are very important. So every day, if you are reading current affairs, if you pick up the points from that, that is more than sufficient. More than sufficient. Like anti-collision device was required, negligence was there, signal issue was there, but all these leads to losses. We refer them as man-made losses. They would have used collision device, they would have used efficiency, they would have used something. So it is error, maybe by human, technological errors. We refer them as the man-made hazards. Is that clear? Done. Now, social natural hazard. Now, what is the social natural hazard and what is needed in this discussion? Now, take an example. Focus on understanding. We come across a natural hazard. We come across a natural hazard. This is a mountain. A mountain is there. So, in the mountain, it is associated with landslide. Landslide. And this landslide is a natural hazard because of steep slopes, because of some events. Large amount of rocks, debris fall downwards. Large amount of rocks, debris fall downward. That is natural hazard. Natural hazard. Now, in this area, we find vegetations are there, trees are there, grasses are there. Now, here if we make deforestation, deforestation means cutting up of the trees, or overgrazing. Overgrazing. The cattle, the sheep, buffaloes, they graze all the grasses here. So whenever deforestation and overgrazing is done, deforestation may be for agriculture activity, maybe for construction activities. Overgrazing and deforestation has been done. So because of overgrazing and deforestation, the vegetation is removed here. Large amount of vegetation is removed. Vegetation is removed, right? Now when the trees are removed, when the vegetations are removed, now what will happen to the incidence of landslides? Will it increase or decrease? So after this deforestation and overgrazing, the natural hazard, which is referred as landslide, as the soil becomes loose, so the landslide will increase or decrease. Perfect. So this landslide will increase. So such types of natural hazards where the human involvement is seen, and that human involvement accelerates the happening of the natural hazards. Such natural hazards, we refer them as socio-natural hazards. Circumstances where the human activities, occurrences of certain hazards beyond their natural probabilities, we refer them as socio-natural hazards. So this is one such example. Apart from that, you can also take one more example, like this area or any area where we find droughts are there. Then that area we find human or human races, they make cutting up of trees, and over exploitation of groundwater is done. So this incidences, cutting up of trees, over exploitation of groundwater, again it reduces the possibility of rainfall, and availability of groundwater is also decreases. Then this drought will occur again and again. again and again. Same is with the floods also. So such types of natural hazards where the human activity is accelerating in their occurrences, we refer that as socio-natural hazards. Is that clear? Socio-natural hazards. Now, these socio-natural hazards, they can be avoided. These socio-natural hazards like floods or vegetation perspectives, they can be avoided. If not, if not, their impact can be reduced. They can be avoided or mitigated. Now remember, mitigated means reducing its impact. Mitigation means reducing its impact. They can be avoided or mitigated. How? By wise use of land resources. Wise use of land resources, maybe groundwater recharging, or maybe creating forest areas, and environment. And environment. So they can be avoided or mitigated by wise use of land resources and environment. If you plant more trees, then this landslide could have been averted. This landslide's impact could have been reduced. If more trees were planted, if more groundwater recharge was done, if more lakes were restored, then Bangalore would have been not having a problem of the drought. Bangalore would have been not having a problem of drinking water at this stage if we have restored the lakes, if we have maintained the rivers, if we have maintained the resources properly. It is the human intervention which makes certain natural hazards to occur and become severe. And such types of natural hazards like landslides, droughts, floods, we refer them as socio-natural hazards. We refer them as socio-natural hazards. Is that clear? So if they ask something on socio-natural hazards, please remember these with example. Any example you can give. So hence, drinking water problem is a socio-natural hazard where the occurrence of drought is accelerated by mismanagement by human activities. Is that clear? Okay. Now next, we move on to something called as vulnerability. Vulnerability. Now what exactly is this vulnerability? In a very simple term, vulnerability means it is degree of resistance to the impact of hazard. It is degree of resistance. Degree of resistance to the impact of hazard. Resistance. Right? Or we say, it is inability. It is inability to handle or cope up the situation effectively. Inability to handle or cope up the condition or situation effectively. It is inability to handle or cope up the condition or situation effectively by individual, society, community, space. We refer that as environment, or country, etc. etc. We refer that as vulnerability. Vulnerability. So remember, it is the degree of resistance or inability to handle or cope up the condition or situation effectively by individual, society, community, environment, etc. So we refer that as vulnerability. Now understand, there is a relationship between resistance and vulnerability. If the resistance is high, if the resistance is high, then vulnerability will be low. Vulnerability will be low. Right? It is something like this. Two individual persons are there, A and B. A has high resistance and B has low resistance. Now, in the impact of COVID, the person who is having less resistance is more vulnerable for COVID rather than the person who is having high resistance. So, resistance is something which is important in the context of vulnerability. Now, the major idea of disaster management is to increase the resistance so that the vulnerability reduces, vulnerability decreases. Is that clear? Now, what conditions defines the vulnerability? Focus on understanding this. Conditions which define the vulnerability. Right? Or factors which defines vulnerability. Right? Understand this. One is referred as physical condition. Physical condition. Now, what is the physical conditions we are talking? If any person is constructing a home in the earthquake prone area or flood prone area, then it is vulnerable for losses. So it is construction of a home in the earthquake prone area or flood prone area. The government will declare that these particular areas are earthquake prone. These particular areas are flood prone areas. So in spite of that, if anybody is constructing them, then it can be led to large amount of losses there. Collapse of building, we refer that as physical condition. Now, second condition which defines that is economic condition. Economic condition. Now, understand this. If you take two areas, Delhi itself, a posh area in Delhi and slum area in Delhi. Take any example of heat waves. Posh area in Delhi and slum areas in Delhi. So, in the impact of heat waves, which people or which community is most affected by the heat waves? The posh settlements or the slum areas? And why they are affected? Any areas, slums, and if we take the areas where they do not have sufficient economic resources to purchase air conditioners and all. So we always find the slums, the poor people are more affected by the impact of heat waves, floods, etc. Why? Because of economic conditions are not rich and poor. So in the economic part, we always come across rich and poor. Now, if we take an perspective of that, who is most vulnerable in the context of such hazards, rich or poor? So we always find poors are more vulnerable. Poors are more vulnerable. Why? Because they do not have air conditioners. They do not have any type of facilities. Take an example of again COVID. So during the COVID, who or which categories of the people were affected the most? The rich or the poor? Obviously it is the poor. Why? Because they could not tolerate the expenses. They were not having the money to make the medical expenses, so hence the casualties were more in the context of poor. So hence we always talk about the economic part which plays an important role. Rich will always have resources, poor are most vulnerable. So in country like India, we always find that the poor people are always something which are most vulnerable. Forget about India, any country for that matter. Poor people where they do not have economic resources, they are the one which are most vulnerable in the context of any type of hazards, right? So immunity, see, I'm not talking about an immunity they may be having, but all poor people will not have the same type of immunity. All will not have same type of immunity. So there are certain points which beyond is then, right? Then we talk about something called as the government or political condition. political condition. Now, in the political conditions, we talk about how the government makes an effort, either in the form of budgetary allocation, what type of budget is there, what type of money it invests, what type of infrastructures, what type of facilities government will provide in the context of all these. So it can be budget or it can be policies. Is it clear? So they also define a very important parameters, budget and policies. Then social conditions. Social conditions. Now, very easy to understand. In the context of COVID, in the context of COVID, in the beginning itself, when the COVID was spreading, they introduced vaccination. Now, when the vaccination program was started, so do you think that all the communities, all the societies agreed to take up the vaccination? The orthodoxy societies and those which are well aware societies, knowledge based societies. So do you think that all uniformly agreed for the vaccination? No. That is called as social conditions. Social conditions. So generally we find the orthodoxy societies, they neglect the initiation. So you need to educate them, you need to make them that this program is beneficial to you. So hence social conditions also makes the vulnerability. So that's why initially large amount of losses were there, because people were not agreed for vaccination part. So we refer that as social conditions. So even the social conditions, if many societies, if they accepts the developments, then there is possibility that they may recover very quickly. So hence social condition is also one of the important factor with reference to the vulnerability perspectives. Is that clear? So the conditions which defines vulnerability are physical factors, like if any area is defined as, see, in the context of Himalayas, we know that Himalaya is vulnerable for earthquake. So in that particular areas, they say that this is earthquake prone area. And in spite of that, if we are constructing the buildings there, residences there, then it can always be vulnerable for earthquake, because it is earthquake prone area. It is physically vulnerable for earthquake because of its location. Is that clear? So such types we refer them as the physical part, right? So please remember these things. Amenity means resources, which we say. Amenity means resources, right? So understand these things, right? Now, the last point here you should remember is this vulnerability. This vulnerability, if you see the vulnerability among rich and poor, among old age and young age, so is this vulnerability is uniformly distributed? Answer this. Is this vulnerability is uniformly distributed among the rich, poor, young age, old age? No. So hence we say vulnerability significantly varies within communities. Please remember this. So this vulnerability, it varies significantly. It varies significantly within communities. Within communities. Very important point. Within communities, it varies significantly. Like rich, poor, strong person, weak person, rural, urban, orthodoxy, developed society. So it always varies within the communities. That is one. Then, second part is this vulnerability. If you see the COVID incidences in the year 2020, the vulnerability of COVID was very high. Why? We did not have vaccination. We did not have awareness. But if you take the data of 2022 and 23 or 2024, we are able to control that. So it means that, can we say the vulnerability of any type of disaster, will it remain same throughout? It does not. It varies from time to time. Sometimes it becomes high, sometimes it becomes very low. So hence we say vulnerability, it varies significantly within the communities, and also it varies over a period of a time. It varies with time. So please remember these 2 points, right? So vulnerability and its perspectives. I hope it is clear now. Fifth point saying the same thing that other 4 points are saying. So which fifth point you are talking about? Right. So be clear with your statements. Frame the statements when you talk about the community part. So this is what you should remember, the condition. So they may ask question. So vulnerability always changes within communities, and vulnerability always changes with time. Sometimes it increases, sometimes it decreases, or maybe due to the more impact of the developments, we find it slowly decreases, right? So this is what you should understand. Vulnerability, degree of resistance, and higher the resistance, lower is the vulnerability. So resistance can be anyways individual, community. So resistance can be of individual, resistance can be of society, resistance can be of community, resistance can be of environment, resistance can be of country. Any word you can put them. And this is where we always need to increase the resistance. We should always increase the resistance of these. Then only we find. Now don't get much confused. Environment means, in ecology and environment, we always come across the physical space. The physical space surrounding us, we refer that as environment. So it's something like this. When you are attending a cricket match, in the cricket match we say the environment is electric. So it means that the physical space surrounding you is referred as environment. When you enter to the temple or mosque, we say the environment is calm, the physical space is calm. So environment means the physical space. It talks about the forest, vegetation, any type of the space, physical space, we refer that as environment, right? So it is a degree of resistance, and whatever I discussed, the same thing is seen here. Varies with community on the basis of economic, political, or social, which all other points are already saying. See, when we talk about vary with the community, it varies with the community. It means that rich and poor. So the summary of all this. So this is the summary of all the points. Don't get confused. Don't get confused. It is not the fifth point. It is not the fifth point. Right, Monica, don't get confused. So 4 points are mentioned. One is physical, economic, political, social. It is not the fifth point. I'm talking about vulnerability. V is vulnerability. It is not 5. It is vulnerability. Is that clear? Don't get confused. It's okay. No, don't get confused. Is it clear now? So it is summary of all that. So hence we say vulnerability varies significantly within the communities, and it also varies with the time. Perfect. Perfect. So if you remember those points, that is more than sufficient. More than sufficient. Now, is it any difficulty in answering any such questions? If you find anything, you just mention so that we can take more on that. Right. Now, if you remember those points and the diagrams, more than sufficient for you to put them. What is your question? Please mention. What is your question? I have not seen. Please mention your question. I'll try to answer to that. Right. Extinction of a species is a, yes, extinction of a species is a disaster. It is a disaster. Sometimes there are many reasons are there. Extinction of a species, we have to see which type of event is there. It is a disaster because, see, whenever when you talk about extinction of a species, it depends on what majority you're talking. If an individual species is extinct, then we don't call it as a disaster. If it is mass extinction, then we refer that as a disaster. Is that clear? So when you talk about extinction of the species, the earth has already experienced 5 mass extinctions, and we are in the verge of 6th mass extinction. So this mass extinction is a disaster. If one or two species are dying, if one or two species are extinct, then we don't call it as a disaster. Is that clear? So it has to be in volume wise. So yes, mass extinction is a disaster, but not individual species. Is that clear? Extraterrestrial hazard. Extraterrestrial means those which are not from this solar system. Take an example of meteorites. Take an example of the asteroids which are colliding to the Earth system. We refer them as extraterrestrial. Extraterrestrial. Tsunami is a natural one. Tsunami is a natural one. We'll discuss what is tsunami and why. Yes, whatever I am explaining, I hopefully think that is more than sufficient. Dinosaurs extinction was something where we find some 60 millions or 65 million years. There are many theories which says the asteroid impacts and large amount of volcanic eruptions which were there. So that is called as one of the important disaster. One of the important disaster when the 75% or more than 80% of the species were washed from the Earth's surface. Right. Social orthodoxy means where the people are having their own religious commitment. They don't accept the science-based perspectives. Like they say vaccination and all against our religion. So we don't go with that. So we don't go with other type of practices. We don't follow what we refer them as isolation, etc. So we refer them as traditional one, traditional methodologies. Degree of resistance means that high, low. Higher resistance, lower resistance, we refer that as degrees. Higher the resistance, lesser is vulnerability. Lower the resistance, higher is the vulnerability. High resistance, low resistance. Is that clear? Okay. Now next, this is the definition. Any definition you can use in the context of your, when you are writing vulnerability profile. Right. Now next we move on to something called as capacity. Resistance means to control. Yes, resistance means it talks about control. We'll talk more on that. We will talk more on that. Focus on this. So you should have to maintain certain patience, because now I'll be talking on the capacity part, right? It's very good that curiosity is there, but along with curiosity you should have certain patience to understand that point also, right? So we'll talk something about capacity. So this capacity is something which is very, very important in the context of your studies. Now what does capacity means? Capacity means it is strength or resistance. It is strength or resistance, or resources. Strength or resistance or resources. I'm repeating, it is strength or resistance or resources which exist, which are with, exist with individual, society, community, country, or or environment. I'm using the term individual, society, community, country, or environment, so that so that they can recover quickly, they can resist to the impact of hazard, or they can handle the situation. Cope up means handle the situation, or they can prevent or mitigate. Prevent or mitigate, or recover quickly, or recover quickly. Recover quickly from the impact of hazard. Recover quickly from the impact, from the impact of hazard. We refer this as capacity. Capacity. Is that clear? Understand. Capacity means it is strength or resistance or the resources which exist within an individual or society or community or country by which they can resist, they can mitigate, they can recover, they can cope up the hazard, and such types of capacities are very, very important. Now, this capacity or strength or resistance, they can be the capacity or the strength of resistance are, or maybe in the form of many parameters, like it can be in the form of leadership. A good leader will always create awareness among the people, so it can be among the leadership, or it can be human knowledge which enhances the perspectives of that, or it can be budget, that is economic resources, or it can be important infrastructures means we are talking about buildings, etc., like earthquake resistant buildings. So where we maintain certain standards, or certain codes where the buildings can be resisting. Now take an example of the Taiwan earthquake, which was last year. Now 50 years back, or say 20 years back, the same place when the earthquake was there, the deaths, the casualties were more. Why? Because they did not have the earthquake resistant building. But last year, when the same area, when the earthquake struck there, the casualties were less, the deaths were less, the losses were less. Why? Because by now they have developed the buildings which are referred as earthquake resistance buildings. They have made retrofitting, they have made many type of the features in that by which they can bear the earthquake shocks, and hence the collapse of the buildings, the injuries, the deaths were reduced. We refer that as the development in the infrastructures or development in research or technologies. So all these types including awareness, etc., so when we have efficient type of leadership, efficient type of knowledge, efficient type of budget, infrastructures, research and development, awareness, then the strength of the society will be more, resistance of the individual will be more, resources will be more, by which we can reduce the impact of hazard here, is it clear? So understand the capacity part. So capacity means it is a strength or resistance or the resources which exist with the individual, society, community, or country by which they can recover, resist, cope up, prevent, mitigate from the impact of hazard. And these capacities or strengths can be of many types in the individual or in the form of leadership. All these are referred as the different types of capacities. And the major idea of disaster management is increase the capacities. Major idea of disaster management is to increase the capacities. More the capacities, less is vulnerability. If the degree of capacity, if the degree of resistance is more, then they will be less vulnerable in the context of any type of hazards. Is that clear now? Can we resist global warming by increasing green cover only? Uh, Now we have crossed what we refer them as threshold point. If we talk about resisting the global warming on green cover, it will take very long time. Because we are already crossed the threshold limit, right? So apart from that, if we talk about green cover, it may take 100 years extra, but we don't know how life can stay. So hence, along with green cover, we need to have certain technologies. So green cover is not sufficient here. Green cover is not sufficient. Yes, it is also very important part. Along with that, if you are taking only technologies and you are not focusing on green cover, how it can be? So along with green cover, simultaneously we need technologies like carbon dioxide sequestration, right? So we refer that as carbon capturing is also mandatory. So along with the tree cover, technologies also combinedly they can reduce the impact. Is that clear now? In disaster management, in prelims, you may get one or two questions there, Gaurav. But in mains, every year, one or two questions will be there with reference to the disasters. One question or two question will be there. Maybe drought, maybe floods, maybe cyclone, maybe something. So one or two questions you can expect in the either in paper 1 or in paper 3. Human knowledge and awareness, telling about the same. See, human knowledge means it can be about science knowledge, it can be about any knowledge what he gains from his skills. So human knowledge means we are talking about the skills what he developed. Awareness means awareness which is generated in the society, awareness which is created in the orthodox society, awareness which is where the people contribute themselves in the context of any type of events here, right? So this is something which we refer them as capacities, right? Now disaster risk. Now understand something which is linked with disaster risk. Now we always come across two terms. One is called as risk and second one is called as crisis, right? So this is the last discussion, then we can have a break. This is the last discussion, then we can have a break, right? So two terms are there, risk and crisis. Now if a person A is investing in the mutual funds. So before investments, whatever potential losses are there, whatever impacts are there, he reads them before investment. So before investing in the mutual funds, he reads them and we refer them as risk involved. So before the event, it is risk involved. And after that, he has invested in that. And then if it brings huge losses to them, then we refer that as crisis. So crisis is the event which takes place after that. So hence, risk is an event which is always before any type of catastrophe has taken place. So in the context of risk, we always calculate possibility of losses. It is likelihood of loss, possibility of life, possibility of injuries. So it is the possible loss in the term of injuries, destruction, damages, etc. And this is calculated before the disaster or before the event. We refer that as risk. So we always say if you are investing somewhere, risk is involved. After investment, when we get a loss, then we say it is crisis. So crisis is something which is later. Risk is something which is in the beginning. So hence we always at present focus on the risk rather than crisis. If we reduce the risk, then the crisis will be less. If you reduce the risk, crisis will be less. Is that clear? So risk is livelihood of loss or life, injuries, etc. Now, the major principle of disaster management, is to identify the risk involved. Identify the risk involved. And once you identify the risk involved, then minimize that risk. That is called as the principle of disaster management. And as a part of disaster risk management, as a part of disaster risk management, we refer that as risk management. As a part of disaster risk management, it is to make assessment of that event, assessment of the event which has occurred. So we refer that as assessing that particular event or analysis of the event, analysis of that particular risk which is involved in the event, analysis or assessment of the risk which is involved in that event. If you are talking about any type of cyclones, assessment, analysis of the risk involved in that cyclone, previous data, and assessing for the next, previous data and assessing for the next. So analysis and assessment of the risk is done, and after that apply strategies and specific action. After that apply specific action and strategies to control, specific action and strategies to control the risk involved in that event, or to reduce the risk involved in that event, or transfer the risk, now how the risk is transferred? Risk is transferred by many events. Example, insurance. So the moment when you are making an insurance, you are transferring the risk, financial risk, to something other. So hence, when we talk about risk or disaster risk, it is about likelihood of losses which is calculated, assessed before the event based on previous and the next event. And the principle of disaster management is identify that, minimize the risk. And the risk management talks about assessment and analysis of the risk and apply specific action and strategy so that you can control and reduce the risk involved in that particular hazard. Is that clear? So this is something about the risk. Catastrophic in small scale cannot be a crisis. So when we say catastrophic in small cases means when you talk about individual one or two, it cannot be referred as a crisis. Sometimes when it is affecting a good number of people, say stampede is something which is referred as an event there, right? So it depends on the people which are affected and also the ability parameters. Then only we can refer them as the events, right? So we can have a break, then we will start the class at now after 10 minutes. So it is, I think, 6:30. So 6:40 we will start the class. 6:45 we will start the class. Okay, so hope I am audible as well as visible to you all, right? So please confirm that I'm audible as well as visible to you all. Perfect. So this is some rough idea about vulnerability. Right. Now next, we moved on to understand certain current related aspects. What is the impact of climate change on disaster? Now the first one is with reference to cyclones. Now here we are talking about tropical cyclones. Tropical cyclones. Now tropical cyclones are also referred as thermal in origin. Why? Because for the formation of tropical cyclones, temperature plays important role. Temperature plays an important role. So temperature around 27 degrees centigrade is required for the development of tropical cyclones. So hence, tropical cyclones are also referred as thermal in origin. Thermal in origin. Now, we know that the oceans are considered as the major sinks. The oceans are considered as the major carbon sink. Carbon sink. So these oceans are absorbing large amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide. They are sequestering carbon dioxide. And because of that, the sea surface temperature of the ocean is increasing. So because of that, the sea surface temperature, that is above surface of ocean, 100 to 200 meters. So we refer that as sea surface temperature. And this is something which is responsible for increasing the number of cyclones, because this carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and greenhouse gases are the best absorbers of heat. Greenhouse gases are the best absorber of the heat, and hence as the temperature increases, the number of cyclones also increases. So hence, in the impact of climate change or global warming, the tropical cyclones will increase in the number. So the numbers will also increase there. Plus, the tropical cyclones are becoming stronger. We refer them as intensifying. Intensifying. So the data says that with increasing of the temperature, the tropical cyclones will double than what we are having, both in Bay of Bengal as well as Arabian Sea, plus also the other oceans like Pacific Oceans, etc. Right? Am I audible or not? Am I visible and audible? Am I visible? Perfect. So please check your connection, Nikhil. Please refresh that. Done. Okay. Okay. Now next is something which is associated with the drought. So because of the droughts, the number of people suffering from the extreme droughts across the world will also increase. Now this is mainly because of change in the precipitation patterns, change in the rainfall patterns. The precipitation patterns have been changed. Has been changed, and hence we find the rainfall has decreased in certain areas, which is responsible for the droughts. Then there is something which is referred as the floods. Now why the floods have been increased? Now understand this carefully. When the temperature increases, evaporation increases in the water bodies, or transpiration increases from the green plants. So when the temperature increases, we always find evapotranspiration increases. Evapotranspiration increases. So it means that more moisture will be there in the atmosphere. This is first point. More moisture will be there in the atmosphere. More evaporation, more transpiration, more moisture will be there. Now, when the wind crosses these surface of the oceans, any wind, when it crosses the surface of an ocean, so this is an ocean here, any ocean or forest areas are there. So from this, if any wind is crossing, this warm wind or the dry wind will have an impact. It is simple. If you're having two cotton towels, one dry towel and already wet towel, if you dip both in the water, which towel will absorb more moisture, the dry towel or the wet towel? Two buckets are there, two cotton towels are there, one is dry and one is wet. Dry will always absorb. The same thing happens here. If the air is dry, then it will absorb more moisture. It will absorb more moisture. So dry air will absorb more moisture. And according to the data, it says that for every 1 degree centigrade increase in the temperature, the air will absorb 7% extra moisture. For every 1 degree rise in the temperature, 7% of extra moisture it will absorb. So if 3 degree increase in the temperature is there, so 3 into 7, 21% of moisture it will absorb. And this moisture laden winds, when it reaches to the coastal area, and after that, when it makes orographic impact or when it brings rainfall, then that rainfall will be heavy or less. This moisture laden winds, when it is carried by the wind, and when it accumulates 7%, 14%, 21% of extra moisture because of its dryness and because of more evaporation which has been done, so that huge amount of moisture which is reaching there, which will always make a huge impact on the precipitation there. So hence, which leads to floods. So hence, many areas in the coastal regions like Kerala, Argentina, right? So they all experiences heavy rainfall because of such conditions. Yes, if you are not willing to risk the usual, you will have to settle for the ordinary. Okay. So this is something which we talk about floods. So please understand that evaporation, air's carrying capacity, both increases. Then heat waves. Now heat waves have also increased. Now we have seen the evidences of that. Extreme heat waves will be there. This is seen in Delhi. And even if you are reading your current affairs, this heat waves were so severe in Mecca yesterday, day for yesterday. Many pilgrimages, they lost their lives here because of extreme heat conditions. Right? So the heat waves are also increasing because of changing of the wind patterns, changing of the climatic patterns here, right? Then infectious diseases have also increased. Then we also find that the sea level rise is seen. Now the sea level rises because of two conditions. One is due to melting of the glacier. When the glacier melts, large amount of water enters there. Second one is when the water is heated, it expands. So when the water expands, obviously the sea level will increases. So due to heat, the water expands. And this water which expands will always have increased sea level. And wildfires have also increased because of dryness due to drought and low rainfall. So we find all these types of disasters, they are accelerated, intensified because of the impact of climate change. See, when we talk about the floods, so floods in the very simple term, due to more temperature, evaporation increases. And the wind which is blowing above the oceans will carry more amount of moisture because dry air or dry wind will always absorb more moisture. And if the temperature of air is 1 degree centigrade more than its normal, it will absorb 7% of extra moisture. And that huge moisture, when it enters to the land area, heavy rainfall will lead to floods. Now, with reference to cyclones, cyclones generally we refer them as tropical cyclones. Here I am discussing about tropical cyclone. Tropical cyclones are also referred as thermal in origin. So when I take cyclones, I'll explain them in detail. So tropical cyclones, so they are referred as thermal in origin. So as the oceans are referred as carbon sink, large amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide is entering into the ocean. We refer that as carbon sequestration. And this carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, which increases the surface temperature of the ocean. And this increased surface temperature is very conducive for the development of tropical cyclones. And not only the tropical cyclones have increased, they are intensifying. It means they are becoming stronger and stronger. Is that clear? So this is something which you should remember. Right. So flood is not secondary. We say flood is a type of socio-natural hazard, or it is an hazard associated with the change in the precipitation patterns as well. Sometimes we may find naturally rivers provides floods, and it is accelerated by human activities. Right. Now, how heat waves increases? Heat waves increases because whenever the climatic conditions varies, pressure gradient changes, and when the pressure gradient changes, the mixing of the hot and cold air decreases, or the winds which can blow in that area decreases. So that is where the patterns of the winds have also changed due to change in the pressure gradient, due to uneven heating of the earth, and also due to the presence of the composition which has been altered there. Right. So these are something which you should remember. Sometimes they may ask climate and its impact on natural disasters. Right. So here the natural disasters are like cyclones and etc. It is not the earthquake. It is not about volcanic activity, but certain disasters like heat waves, floods, droughts, where the climate affects them. Is that clear? Next, if we take the India, geographically India has coastline, and India has seventh largest area. So if you see the geographical extent of India, India is seventh largest in area. Right. Second, India is, according to 2011 census, it is second populous. We have not received the 2021 census. So hence we say it is having a high population, and density of population is also very high. Density is also very high. Then India has a long coastline of 7,516 kilometers. India has a long coastline of 7,516 kilometers. That is total coastline of India. Right. Then if we take India, we always find rich and poor are there. So in the context of India, economic disparity, is it uniform or it is very high? Economic disparities. Economic disparities in India, are they high or less? So these economic disparities in India are very high. They are very high. Right. So when we see all these parameters, seventh largest area, populous part, long coast, economic disparities are very high disparities. Then if we take India's geographical landforms, India consists of deserts, India consists of plains, India consists of mountains, valley, etc. So different type of landforms are there. And if you see the India's climatic conditions or rainfall patterns, we refer that as monsoon pattern. Periodic rainfall is there. So hence we find that these are the conditions which make India vulnerable for many natural disasters. So these conditions make India vulnerable for many disasters. Vulnerable for many disasters. And if you see the state-wise breakup also, we find that many states are there affected by different type of disasters. Some of the climate-based disaster or weather-based events here. If you take the coastal area of Andhra Pradesh, so Andhra state, it is affected by cyclones, it is affected by heat waves, and it is also affected by floods. So these are the extreme events which are affecting the states and concerned areas. So please go through this map, go through this map, and by that you can understand that which state is vulnerable for which type of extreme weather based events. Extreme weather based event. Weather based events. If you take Telangana, so Telangana is most affected by heat waves. Heat waves. If you take West Bengal, West Bengal is affected by cyclones, it is affected by floods, it is affected by lightning. So all these are seen in the West Bengals. So these are the extreme weather-based conditions which affect the different states and union territories of India. States and union territories of India. And these conditions, seventh largest area, population density, long coastline, economic disparities, agrarian economy, industries there. All these makes India one of the country which is vulnerable or most vulnerable for natural disasters. Right. So hence India is considered as one of the country which is one of the most vulnerable because of such conditions. So please remember these points. When you are writing your answers, please remember these points. Is that clear? And hence, if you take 36 states and union territories, out of these 36 states and union territories, 27 states and union territories are disaster prone. It means they are affected by different type of disasters. So they are affected by different disasters. Disasters like cyclones, heat waves, or some of the states they are affected by earthquakes, landslides, etc. Right. So this is what you should remember. Right. We have 28 states and 8 union territories. So if we add 28 plus 8, that is 36. Right. And out of these 36, 27 are disaster prone. So out of these 36, 27 are disaster prone. Is that clear? So here, when we talk about disasters, it includes extreme weather based and the disasters like earthquake as well. Earthquake as well. Is it clear? So remember, if we talk about India, India is one of the most vulnerable country for disasters. India is one of the most vulnerable country. One of most vulnerable. Please fix this in the mind. Please fix this in the mind. Most vulnerable. See, regarding the questions, I'll be taking up previous year questions once we discuss at least 2 days of class. So we have ample amount of questions which were asked in UPSC mains. So I'll be taking up previous year's question. So at least we will discuss 2 days class or 3 days class. Then I'll take up the previous PYQs. I will take up. So there are many questions. If you go through the previous year question papers, last year question paper, you will come across many questions which were asked from this section, right? So India is one of the most vulnerable because of its size. Again, I'm mentioning size, because of its population, because of its coastal area, 7,516 kilometer coastal area, because of economic activity, that is agriculture, and also we have industries. Industries are there. Then large amount of economic disparities. Disparities are there. Then geological setup. The Himalayas were formed when the Indian plate collided with the Eurasian plate, right? So we find Himalayas, which is formed due to Indian plate colliding with the Eurasian plate. That is collision of the plates. And hence it is vulnerable for earthquake. Himalayan belt, vulnerable for earthquake. So geology aspect, then the landform aspect. Landform aspect, deserts are there, valleys are there, mountains are there. Then demography, structure of population. We refer that as demography. Old age, then young population, old population. So all these make the conditions which are most vulnerable. Apart from that, if we take India, most part of the India, that is the Tropic of Cancer is there, where we find major portion of India is within the tropics. So this area, right? So hence we find most of the areas are in the tropical climatic condition. Tropical condition. Economic disparities means rich and poor. Rich and poor. So majority of India's geographical extent is what we refer them as tropical area, right? So remember this point. Most vulnerability. Now, apart from this, you have to remember one more important term. There is something called as IPCC. Have you heard about IPCC? Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. IPCC, intergovernmental body which always gives science-based inputs in the context of climate change. It always gives science-based input in the context of climate change. In the context of climate change, science-based data, and they are very important in conference of parties when the discussions are done, right? So here this IPCC, it always gives the reports. We refer them as assessment reports. Assessment reports, and it has already given 6 assessment reports which plays an important role in the climate change parameters. And among the reports which it has given, the fourth assessment report, which was given in the year 2007. In the fourth assessment report, it highlighted that the tropical countries are the one which will be more affected by extreme weather-based disasters. Will be affected by extreme weather-based disasters like cyclones, heat waves, cold waves, drought, flood, forest fires, etc. So it says that cyclones, heat waves, cold waves, drought, floods, fires, etc. will increase where? In the tropical countries. And if you take the position of India, so this is equator, and here we are having Tropic of Cancer, and this is Tropic of Capricorn. And if you see the location of India, so we find most portion of India is affected by that. Why? Because major portion of India is within the Tropic of Cancer and equator, where we find such conditions are predominant. So hence, as per IPCC, which has highlighted, now we are experiencing cyclones have increased, heat waves have increased, cold waves increased, droughts increased, floods increased, and the forest fires have also increased. And these are mainly due to the impact of the climate change. Impact of climate change, right? And this is something which you have to remember. The IPCC, which has highlighted that extreme weather conditions will be experienced by the countries which are in the tropical areas, and India is also one among them, where major portion is experiencing the extreme weather based hazards, disasters, or events. Is that clear? So if any question is asked on India's vulnerability, you have to remember these slides. One slide, assessment of that. Second slide, out of 36 states and union territories, that is 28 plus 8, 27 are disaster prone. And then India is most vulnerable because of its geological setup, because of its location, because of its demography, and because of its economic activities. Activities. Then, last but not the least, IPCC has highlighted that all the tropical countries will be experiencing extreme weather based disasters or the hazards over a period of a time, and already all the countries are experiencing such types of events. Is that clear? Okay, so please remember this, and this can be very important when you are writing any answer on where introduction is seen, or this can be used as way forward. It can be used as way forward. Is that clear now? Basics and these perspectives. Right. Now, if you see the vulnerability profile of India, if you see the vulnerability profile of India, out of the total land of India, if we take the geographical area of India, including the coastlines, the total area of India is in million hectares. It is 329 million hectares. India has 329 million hectares. This is its area, and its total coastline is 7,516 kilometers. Right. Main coastline is 6,100. Main coastline, excluding Andaman Nicobar, Lakshadweep, it is 6,100 kilometers. Main coastline includes Andaman Nicobar, Lakshadweep, Pamban Island. So all islands are included here. All are included here. Right. Now, with its geographical extent and the nature, if you see the different type of earth, different types of events there. If you see the vulnerability profile of India, with reference to natural hazards, the first one is earthquake. Out of the total land area, that is 329 million hectares, 58.9% of the total area is vulnerable for earthquake. 58.9% of the total area is vulnerable for earthquake. Right. Then, second, if you talk about the floods, the second event is floods. So, out of the total land area 329 million hectares, 40 million hectares, or 12% of area, average 40 million hectares or 12% of area is vulnerable for floods. Vulnerable for floods. 329 million hectares, that is your geography term. MH means million hectares, that is geographical area of India. Million hectares, million hectares, right? The third one is about the cyclones, tsunamis, and the storms. All three parts. So, out of the total coastline, which is 7,516 kilometers, 5,700 is vulnerable. 5,700 kilometers is vulnerable. Vulnerable for cyclones, tsunamis, storms, etc. Right? So earthquake, floods, cyclones, tsunamis, etc. Now, when we talk about the droughts, so in the context of India, out of the total geographical area, 329 million hectares, we have 50%, we have a very small area where irrigation facilities are there. And majority of that area is rain fed. So out of this 329 million hectares, 140 million hectares, 150 million hectares, which is referred as net sown area of India. Net sown area of India for agricultural crop is rain fed. Is rain fed. Sorry. So 140 million hectares is net sown area, out of which 50% or 70 million hectares. Remember these data. 140 million hectares is rain fed area, is net sown area. In that net sown area, 50% of the net sown area or 70 million hectares is rain fed. Rain fed. And this rain fed area is vulnerable for drought. Vulnerable for drought. Apart from that, we also find landslides, land subsidence, etc., which makes 12% of the total area. So this is referred as the vulnerability profile of India, and all these data are provided by National Disaster Management Authority. They are very important factual data. These numerical data are very important. If you are writing anything on, say, cyclones or any event, you have to remember this data. These data are very important. And these data are given by National Disaster Management Authority. You have to remember these data. There will not be any variation in these data. Still, they explain them. So please remember, at least these facts are important. Maybe for your prelims or maybe for your mains also, you have to remember these data. You practice them 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, then it becomes easy for that. Clear? Okay. Now next, we move on to something called as disaster management cycle. Is that clear? India's vulnerability. Many times question will be here. NDM means National Disaster Management Authority. National Disaster Management Authority. We'll take up that later. Authorities. No. We always find two types of disasters are there. Man-made disasters. And then we are having natural disaster. Man-made and natural disaster. Now, man-made disasters can be avoided. Man-made disasters, they can be avoided or they can be prevented by policies, action, awareness, right? So we can avoid or prevent the man-made disasters. But when we come down to natural disasters, they cannot be avoided. They cannot be avoided. You can't prevent them. You can't prevent them. Right? But we can reduce or mitigate its severity and its impact. In both the cases, when you are unable to prevent that, the event has occurred, either in the man-made or in the natural factors. We can reduce or mitigates. We can reduce or mitigate. Now remember, mitigate means reducing. Reduce or mitigate, both are same. We can reduce or mitigate its intensity and severity. Its intensity and severity. We can reduce or mitigate its intensity or severity. How? By proper management or effective management and continuous process. Effective management and continuous process. Right, effective management and continuous process. It is not one time, it is a continuous process. And this continuous process, it consists of three key phases. Three key phases. And these three key phases are things which happen before the disaster. We refer that as pre-disaster. This is the first phase. Then, at the time of disaster, this is the second phase. So, before disaster, pre-disaster, at the time of disaster, and then post-disaster. Post-disaster. So, three key phases are there. Before the disaster, at the time of disaster, and post-disaster. Post-disaster. We refer them as three key phases. And these three key phases, they consist of 6 main activities. 6 main activities. Is that clear? And we refer this as disaster management cycle. We refer this as disaster management cycle, which consists of these three phases: pre-disaster management, at the time of disaster, and post-disaster management. Three phases, which consist of 6 activities. They are preparedness, mitigation, prevention, development, recovery, response. 6 key elements are there. Is it clear? Now, anything which is before the disaster is referred as crisis or risk. Anything which is before the disaster is referred as crisis or risk. Risk. So in the pre-disaster management, risk is managed or crisis is managed. In the pre-disaster management, perfect. So in the pre-disaster management, we always make risk management. Risk management. And in the post-disaster management, we always manage crisis. In the post-disaster management, crisis management is done. Crisis management is done. Is it clear? So risk in the pre-disaster, crisis in the later. That is after the event. Now during the disaster, so whatever services, whatever activities are there, we refer them as critical services. We refer them as critical services, which includes food, water, medicine, etc. Medicines, etc. Now, if the critical services are given effectively and well in the time, if the critical services are provided effectively, then crisis will increase or decrease. Obviously, better critical services, the crisis will reduce. More critical services, the crisis will reduce. So in the context of disaster management, the first aspect is try to reduce the risk as much as possible. Reduce the risk as much as possible. Then provide effective critical services so that the crises are reduced. So this is what we refer them as the 3 key phases and 6 parameters of disaster management. So generally in the post-recovery phases, we always talk about something called as rescue, relief, then resettlement, rehabilitation, etc. Rescue, relief, resettlement, rehabilitation. So that's why when the train accident was there, many authorities say that the rescue and relief measures reached 1 hour late after the incident, and that's why the casualties were more. I'm repeating, the train accident which was there, many authorities, many agencies suggested or complained that the rescue measures and relief measures reached there, but they were late by 1 hour or 2 hours. Because of that, the injuries, the casualties, the deaths were more. So hence, these rescue operations and relief operations plays an important role at the time and in the post-disaster management. Is that clear now? So this is referred as the 3 phases: risk management at the time and crisis management. And I have discussed what is risk. Now, the 3 important factors, the first one is when we talk about pre-disaster management, very significant is prevention. You try to prevent that. You try to prevent that event as much as possible. So prevention is better than cure. Prevention is better than cure. When you are unable to prevent that, then you try to reduce its impact. I'm repeating, try to prevent that in the beginning. And if you are unable to prevent that, you try to reduce that. And something where you are reducing, we refer that as mitigation. If you are unable to prevent, you mitigate that. Mitigation means reduce the impact of that. Reduce the impact of that. Then, if in spite of doing prevention, in spite of mitigating, when the event occurs often and often, you have to make adaptation, or we refer that as preparedness. Preparedness. So, in spite of prevention, in spite of mitigation, if the event is happening, then you have to prepare that. You have to be prepared to that. So we refer that as preparedness. So remember three terms: prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. So preparedness and mitigation is something where you try to reduce its impact in the beginning itself. Preparedness includes if any cyclones are there, you have to construct a barrier to that. Maybe you have to grow mangroves, maybe you have to create artificial embankment, or maybe you can construct walls so that the floods are reduced, or you can construct shelter camps where we can take care of the people food, or you can create the capacity of the local people by awareness, understand the capacity by knowledge, by knowledge, by skills, earthquake prone buildings, flood prone buildings. We refer that as preparedness. We refer that as preparedness. Is that clear? First, try to prevent, if not mitigate. And in spite of prevention and mitigation, if the chances are there, you have to prepare for the event. You have to prepare for the event. And this preparation can be done by awareness in the community, skills of the community, skills of the people, infrastructure, budgets, finances, permanent structures. So by this, you can make the preparedness and reduce the impact of the hazard here. So we refer that as the three perspective of pre-disaster management: prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. I hope it is clear. 3 points. Right. So mask, vaccination. See, when we talk about use of mask, vaccination and all, so prevention in the sense, using of the mask is prevention. Using of the mask is prevention. Right. Now, in spite of the mask, there is a possibility that you may have the COVID. Then vaccination is mitigation. So mask, social distancing is prevention. In spite of prevention, there is possibility. So that is mitigated by something called as vaccination. The moment when the vaccination is there, you have reduced its severity. You have reduced the severity of the COVID. So vaccination is a mitigation effort. Mask, social distancing is prevention. Then setting up of high standards in the hospitals, medical instruments, oxygen supply, everything is referred as preparedness. So many things, in spite of mitigation, when it is affected, we refer that as preparedness. Is that clear now? Yes, in the order you say, in the order. So I have given the numbers. So preparedness, mitigation, I have given the numbers to tell these are. So if you put in the order, you can say it is prevention. If you put in the order, you can say prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. 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 So as it is a continuous cycle, it is collaboration of all the three. It is collaboration of all the three. Simultaneously, we make preparedness. Simultaneously, we make mitigation. Simultaneously, we make prevention. See, when you talk about COVID, so it is not that only masks were introduced. Along with the mask, vaccination was there. Along with the mask and vaccination, infrastructure development. So it is the collaboration of all the three. Is that clear? So prevention, mitigation, and preparedness, continuous process is seen there. Is that clear? Is that clear? So this is something we refer them as pre-disaster management. Now, in the context of pre-disaster management, there are certain disasters which are extreme weather based. There are certain disasters which are extreme weather based events, like cyclones, floods, etc. Cyclones, floods, etc. Extreme weather based one, we refer them as cyclones, floods, etc. So in these types of disasters where extreme weather based conditions are there, so in this, one of the important aspect of pre-disaster management is early warning system. One of the important aspect of this is early warning system. Early warning system. We don't have early warning system for earthquake. We don't have early warning system for volcanoes, but we have the early warning system for extreme weather based phenomena like cyclones, floods, cloud burstings, etc. Early warning systems are there, and these early warning system plays an important role in pre-disaster management, and that too extreme weather based disasters. Now these early warning systems make the people to make sure that whatever important necessity things are there, they will accumulate, they will take with them, and by which they can reduce the impact of that particular hazard. Is that clear? So please remember this. In the disaster management cycle, pre-disaster management is very, very important. And this is about managing the risk. And it consists of prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. The knowledge capacities, the government capacities, etc. So we refer that as three key points. Right. And in the pre-disaster management, so whatever I told, the same things are there. Capacity building. So it talks about capacity buildings, individual and all. Right. So reconnect that. Capacity means resistance, strength, and resources. Resistance, strength, and resources. Right. So this is something. Venn diagrams are very, very important. Venn diagrams are very important. So you have to give them in the flow charts. You can use flow charts. They are very important. Right. Then early warning system. So remember, early warning system is only for extreme weather based condition. We don't have early warning system for earthquake. We don't have early warning system for volcanoes. It is only for extreme weather based conditions, which gives about knowledge of the risk, monitoring and forecasting of the hazard. It talks about communication of alert and warning. So this communication is done by many methodologies. Like we are having many apps are there, like Quake app, Quake app, or we are having the Sagarwani app, mobile apps, which disseminate the information, or alert systems, mobile alert system. So many times we find National Disaster Management Authority, sometimes with the Google, they send a message or they try to check the alert vibrations in the mobiles are there with reference to disasters. So they say that we are making mock drills regarding the disaster and their preparedness. So it is by using the apps, by using the alert systems, by which the local people prepare themselves in the context of any type of events there. Is it clear? So please remember the early warning parameters. Then during the disaster, whatever things are there, we refer them as critical services. Critical services, which includes search and rescue, medical aid, food, shelter, etc. So we refer them as critical services or emergency responses. And the last one is the post disaster recovery. So this always talks about reconstruction, resettlement, rehabilitation, etc. So generally we refer that as, it talks about build back better. Build back better. Is that clear? So it is based on previous data. It is based on their experience, government, and all. So it generally talks about resettlement and more amount of rehabilitation. Right. And the idea of post disaster is quick recovery. Quick recovery. Is it clear? So, if any area where the earthquake has occurred, so it should not take 5 years, 10 years to recover. It should be recovering very quickly. So, we refer them as post disaster recovery phase. So, pre disaster at the time and post disaster, which talks about build back better. Right. Now, we move on to understand certain disasters. Now, before moving on to certain disasters, understand that. So, any questions when you are writing in the context of national disaster management, natural disaster management, or man-made man-made disaster, any natural disaster or man-made disasters, we always talk about two measures: structural measures and non-structural measures. Structural measures and non-structural measures, right? And both plays an important role in making the capacity, both plays an important role in building the capacity in the beginning or in the late also. They play an important role in capacity. Now, what type of structural measures are there? Structural measures including engineering works, engineering works, or sometimes natural activities like natural activities or nature based activities like growing of vegetation or growing of mangroves. So in the structural measures, you are constructing a permanent structure. You are constructing a structure here. Engineering work or naturally done. Or sometimes when we use a technology like in the slopes to stabilize the slopes, we use a technology like mesh is used in the slopes. Or sometimes we construct the barriers or walls, steel rods, barriers, rods, etc., so that the impact is reduced. So we refer that as structural measures, where engineering work is done, where vegetation is grown, something is created, something is structured. We refer that as structural measures. Now, what are non-structural measures? What are non-structural measures? Non-structural measures includes finance involved. What type of finance is there? What type of budget allocation is done? Awareness, awareness which is created. Leadership, leadership. Training, training which is given to that. Mesh means the nets. So when I take landslides, I'll explain that. Mesh means nuts, right? Mosquito net, mesh, right? So finance, awareness, leadership, training, right? Skills, government policies, acts, disaster management acts. So where we don't find the structures, so we refer them as non-structural measures. Acts, policies, frameworks, budget allocation, awareness, leadership, all these are referred as non-structural measures. And structural measures, it talks about engineering works, natural barriers, or sometimes the codes which have been maintained in the construction, like the codes which are maintained in the buildings, standards which they have to maintain when they are constructing the building in the earthquake prone areas. Codes or standards. So if you are constructing any home in the earthquake prone area, then you should remember that you have to maintain certain code, certain standards. And such types of activities, we refer them as structural measures. Now, any event, any disaster, any hazard will always have structural measures and non-structural measures. So please keep this in the mind. Please keep this in the mind. Is that clear? Structural measures and non-structural measures. Right. Now we move on to the first natural disaster or socio-natural disaster called as the floods. So if you take the floods, you have to always mention the vulnerability of India. So in the context of India, we always say 40 million hectares or 12% is vulnerable for floods. 12% is vulnerable for floods. Now, after that, you have to give the definition of the flood. So, the definition of flood is submergence of the new land or rise in the water level of already submerged land. We refer that as flood. So, it is submergence of a land, that is new land, submergence of a new land, or increase in the depth of partially submerged land. We refer that as floods. This is a simple definition of the floods. Right. So whenever when you are writing, you should have some idea that what exactly is the flood. Some rough idea. Now, in the context of National Disaster Management Authority, NDMA, it has given two reasons for the floods. It has given two reasons for the floods. Right. Now, these reasons, it classifies them into two characteristics. One is natural reason, and second one is man-made reason. Man-made or anthropogenic factor. Now, in the natural one, we can say it is mainly due to heavy rainfall, heavy precipitation, or maybe due to cloud bursting. Cloud bursting. Third one is maybe because of cyclones which enter into coastal area. Cyclones or storms. Then fourth is mainly due to the rivers. Maybe due to heavy rainfall when the spilling takes place. Maybe due to heavy rainfall, the spilling takes place. Or sometimes when the rivers changes their courses. When the river changes their courses. Now, if you are reading your current affairs, once Damodar was referred as the sorrow of Bengal. Now it is no more referred as sorrow of Bengal. Now, which river in India is referred as the sorrow of Bihar? Which river in India is referred as sorrow of Bihar? Right, perfect. Kosi. Now, why Kosi is referred as the sorrow of Bihar? Because it changes its course, and wherever it changes its course, it will always create floods. It always create the floods. Right. Now, hence we say rivers also dominate spilling during monsoon, and also certain rivers like Kosi, which are responsible for floods due to changing of its courses. So these are referred as natural one. Now, what are the man-made reasons for that? Now, the man-made reasons for that is construction of the dams. It is very simple to understand. If this is a dam area, a dam is constructed and a river is flowing in this direction. This is A portion of a dam. This is B portion of a dam. The river is flowing from A to B. Now, this river will always have sediments. It will carry the sediments along with that. Now, whenever the dams are constructed, it will act as a barrier, and the sediments will drop and settle in this area. Now, when the sediments settle in this area, now this region of a river A, the water or the river will become shallow. So, this area, the river will become shallow. And the moment when the river becomes shallow, then during the rainy season, which area you will find the floods is dominant, at A or at B? So during the rainy season, where do you find the floods will be dominant? At the region A or at the region B of a river? Of a river here, due to construction of dam. Perfect. That is A area. So this is called as dam part. Dam part. So dam construction is one. Second, so whenever when we construct the dam, so there is possibility of cracks in the dams because they are all man-made structures, or damage which is done because of many events there. So when the cracks are there, when the wall is get destroyed, so it will make flooding of the areas. So the destruction of the dam will always make floods in the coastal areas or in the areas where they are seen. Is that clear? Then third one is something called as deforestation. So whenever deforestation is done, large amount of debris will move downward and they reach to the river. And these silts or the rocks or the debris, they will enter the river and they will make the river shallow. And this is responsible for the floods. Right. This will something which is associated. Dams are constructed to control the flow of water. So here, when we talk about the dams, initially in the beginning, if you are reading your knowledge-based data, so these dams, if you are reading the present scenarios, they say that these were something which were used to make the assessments or resources assessment. Now they themselves are becoming threat for many type of events. Like if a dam is not constructed on the area which is assessed, is responsible for seismic hazards. Now, in the same way, whenever the dams are constructed, if the desiltation process is not done properly, then that can lead to floods in those areas because large amount of sediments will accumulate on one side. That is also seen. Plus, if the movement of certain water is stopped during the summer season, it will make or it will act as a barrier for biodiversity. So the biodiversity is also disturbed there. So hence the dams were constructed as an advantageous, but because of mismanagement, we find they have become a potential threat in the context of earthquake, in the context of floods, and also they are also associated with destruction of the biodiversities because the fish species and aquatic animals which can move from one region to another region, they are stopped due to the barrier during the summer season. So hence these dams are something which are becoming the major reason for earthquakes, floods, and biodiversity at present. So please read this aspect of dams in the present scenarios. Is that clear? Koina Dam was responsible for the earthquake. Koina Dam was responsible for earthquake, right? So this is something where you have to see. So traditional and the present scenarios. Yes, I agree. I agree that dams were constructed with some part, but now they are having certain ill impacts also. Is that clear? So this is something which you have to remember in the context of the floods. Right. Now, the next part is the flood prone areas in India. It means where do you find the vulnerability? So according to the National Disaster Management Authority, you should always use this. According to National Disaster Management Authority, entire India is divided into zones. We refer them as flood prone area zones. Flood prone area zones. And here, if you see the zones, the first one is most frequent and intensive flooding. So, most frequent and intensive flooding is that area where we find average flooding. Average flooding is 4 to 6 weeks every year. Average flooding is 4 to 6 weeks every year. We refer that as most frequent and intensive flooding. And this includes the two river systems of India, Ganga river system and Brahmaputra river system. Ganga river system and Brahmaputra river system. It includes two river systems, Ganga and Brahmaputra river systems. Systems. I'm using the term systems. It means main river and its tributaries. Main river and its tributaries. Then less frequent and intensive flooding. So these are area where we find average flooding is 2 to 4 weeks every year. Average flooding is 2 to 4 weeks. 4 weeks every year. Every year. And this includes the entire Bay of Bengal. This area. Coastline, East Coast or Bay of Bengal. It includes the entire region of Bay of Bengal or East Coast. East Coast. Plus, it also includes the two rift valleys, rivers which are flowing west side. Two rivers which are flowing in the west side, and they are rift valleys. That is Narmada and Tapi river system. Plus Narmada and Tapi. In Tapi river system. Then the third one is least frequent and intensive flooding, where we find average flooding is less than 2 weeks. Less than 2 weeks. Less than 2 weeks in a year. We refer that as least frequent and intensive flooding. And these includes the Malabar rivers, the rivers of Malabar region, plus the Satluj and Yamuna river. Right. So it includes Satluj and Yamuna river. Yamuna river. You have to draw the map, Vaibhavi. You have to draw the maps. See, it is very simple. You can show that most frequent is the northern plain and Brahmaputra plain. Then less frequent is Bay of Bengal and Narmada Tapi. And the third one is Malabar and Satluj and Yamuna. So these were the three zones. Now, along with that, please understand, we had a systematic record of the heavy rainfall which was there in the year 2005 in Mumbai. And this rainfall in the Mumbai was totally disastrous one, where in a single day more than 10 centimeters of rainfall was there. And then this Mumbai episode became an eye-opener. It became an eye-opener, where it shows that the floods which were there in Mumbai are totally different from what we get. The reasons were different. The impact were different. The reason for Mumbai flood was totally different what they experienced in the three areas. And the impact was also different as it was urban area. Reasons were different, impacts were different, which became an eye-opener of 2005. And hence, from 2007, National Disaster Management Authority added the fourth zone, which is referred as urban floods. Urban floods. And here, the reasons and the impacts are totally different. The class will wind up at 8 p.m. So it is 5 to 8. So it will wind up at 8 p.m. So here we find urban floods are there. So hence, if you are writing anything, as per National Disaster Management Authority, entire country is divided into four flood prone zones. Three are referred as rural floods, and then we are having urban floods. Is that clear now? So most frequent, less frequent, and least frequent. So these are referred as the flood prone areas. Now whenever when you are attempting any question, you have to draw this map. It is not that difficult. It is not difficult. And remember, 1, 2, 3, and 4 zones. So from 2007, we have added one more flood prone zone, which is referred as urban flood. Is that clear? Right. Okay. So if we see the urban floods, the submergence of the urban areas due to sudden rainfall, melting of snow, etc., we refer them as urban floods. Now we find the urban floods areas have increasing. The major reason is natural increase in the urban area. Natural increase in the urban areas. Because as per the census, if you take the census definitions and all, whatever urban area was there in 1951, if you take the data of 2011, we find because of change in the population, because of change in the criteria and characteristics as per the 1991 census. So in the year 1991 census, we have used certain definitions to classify the areas as urban and rural. So here we find many areas, as the population, their economic activities are changing, so many areas are added into urban. Take a data. If you compare the data of 2011 and 2001, so in between the 2001 and 2011, so this much of total area was added because of changing of the demography and because of changing of the criterias which were given by 1991 census. So this is one thing, natural increase in the urban areas. Apart from that, the urban floods are also increased due to increasing of the population, which is over exploiting of resources, over exploitation of resources, and the activities like dumping of the debris and all. So we will see them in detail. What are the major reason for urban floods? What are the major reason for urban floods? Is it clear? So we can conclude the class today. So we'll continue the class tomorrow exactly at 5 p.m. So 5 to 8 p.m. we'll have. So don't get much stress. Be with the flow. Understand wherever points are there. Understand wherever important discussions are there. Make a note of that. Try to put them into your flow charts. Take recent examples, and then it becomes easy for you to write any question. And again, I'll tell you that if you follow the PPTs and the discussions, that is more than sufficient for you to write any answers which are asked in the disaster management. That I can assure you. And along with this, you can improve your data by updating from current affairs. All the terms, all the concepts, I'll clear that. I'll make sure that it is my responsibility. I'll clear that. You should make updations of current affairs. I'm taking the present current affairs. If anything is there next month, you please add that as your current affairs. So with that, I'll conclude the today's session, and tomorrow we'll meet up at the same. Right. Rather than using the shades, you have to use only one color. Multiple colors are not allowed in the UPSC mains examination. Use only one pen, put them into marks. So that is more than sufficient. You can just show the circle and put them, because there is very less amount of time which is there. So rather than putting them into formatting like what you do in your college days, so you won't get much time. So draw them with the single pen and try to put them as simple as possible, just marking them. Don't use much shades and much color features. because examiner or the evaluator will also know that there is always a shortage of time is there. So try to put them. This exam is not about your knowledge, it's about how you use your knowledge in time duration. Within that 3 hours, how best you capitalize your knowledge, that is important. So if you are reading the mains, if you think that only knowledge is sufficient, that is not going to help you. Along with the knowledge, presentation is important. Along with the knowledge, how you put them into is very, very important, right? So ball pen or gel pen, anything is used, whichever is comfortable to you. If you are comfortable with the ball pen, use that. Practice with the pen many times. Your flow should not be disturbed, your writing should be legible. So that should be kept in the mind. Don't try to make more decorative. Don't decorate your answers. Maintain very simple base. Wherever it is feasible, draw maps. Wherever it is feasible, draw charts, and if necessity, underline that. Only these things I can tell. Draw maps where possible, flow charts where possible, underline the key terms. Do not underline entire sentences, underline only the key terms which are there, right? So we'll meet up again few years. Yes, so that floods and all we will take up. We'll take up that, Arumita. So when I take other parts of the floods tomorrow, you can post the question. We will discuss on that. You have to draw the map with pens. Don't use pencils. If you are drawing the map with the pens, then it is a sign of maturity. Please understand that. When you are drawing the map with pen, then evaluator will understand that yes, this person is having certain sign of maturity where he can draw the pens, because with the pencils you can rub and draw, but with the pens you can't draw one single diagram is there. So practice as much as possible. So it is all about your knowledge, your maturity, your presentation. Everything is linked when they score the marks, right? So if somebody is drawing with the pen in a one single go, it means that he will understand, yes, this person is something which is beyond average. And when you are making the drawings without mistakes, it means that you are having less errors, it means you are having less doubts. So all these counts much when you're talking about exam. So this exam is not only about your knowledge, it's about your presence of mind. It's about presence of mind. It also talks about how best you use your resources. So it talks about knowledge, it talks about presence of mind, it talks about what best way you use your resources. If you combine all the three, no god can stop you to fetch the post what you seek for. So please understand, three combinations are there: knowledge, presentation, presence of mind. All three have weightage here. So we'll meet up tomorrow. Thank you. So prelims, they will announce the dates. Maybe in 45 days, they will announce the result.